Welcome to Velvet Crimes. I am Dr. John Watson, your narrator, and tonight I recall a case that began not with a crime scene, but with an image on paper. A simple photograph meant to capture a moment of joy revealed in its corner a face no one recognized, a figure standing where none should have been. From that spectral presence in the background unraveled a mystery that led Holmes and me into shadows of identity and intent. Tonight's tale is the stranger in the photograph's background. Before we begin, let me remind you, Holmes often said that what others call coincidence is usually design. Tell me, are you listening late at night or during your morning tea? Stay with us. Each week a new puzzle unfolds. Now light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. It began with a fog, one of those November fogs that blurs the line between lamp and ghost, the sort that creeps up from the Thames like a slow, deliberate hand closing over the throat of the city. Baker Street had vanished by late afternoon, swallowed in a miasma of soot and silence, the gaslights along the pavement flickering like the last thoughts of a dying mind. I had taken refuge indoors with the Times, a fire at my back and my companion deep in one of his studied sulks, as I had come to call them, those prolonged spells in which Sherlock Holmes became neither man nor machine, but a suspended calculation awaiting a variable. Holmes had been silent for hours, lounging in his chair with one foot propped against the mantel, eyes closed, hands steepled. There were no clients, no telegrams, no tobacco experiments. He had not even complained about the violin's pitch. Then came the knock. Not the hurried, breathless rapping of some desperate soul, nor the hesitant tap of a client too timid to disturb the great detective. No, this was measured, almost academic, a professor's knock. Holmes opened one eye. I half rose. "Enter," he said without shifting his position. Mrs. Hudson showed in a gentleman of medium build and early middle age, with a thick moustache and pince-nez that seemed permanently fogged. His overcoat was neatly buttoned but showed signs of anxious pacing. In his gloved hand he held an envelope, large, cream-coloured, with a wax seal already broken. Holmes motioned toward the chair opposite. "Pray sit down, and if you'd be so kind as to share what storm has driven you to our hearth." The man complied, his gaze darting briefly to me before settling on Holmes. "My name is Percy Atwood. I'm the curator of photographic archives at the Covington Institute, just south of Kensington. I am not accustomed to consulting detectives, Mr. Holmes, but this is rather beyond my remit." He extended the envelope. Holmes took it delicately and removed a photograph, black and white, matte finish, the sort produced by cabinet card studios of the late 1880s. It was a posed image of an outdoor lecture. Rows of well-dressed students seated before a small dais, the lecturer mid-gesture, sunlight falling across the lawn. But Holmes's attention, as mine followed his, was not on the foreground. In the far background, partially obscured by a tree, barely more than a silhouette, stood a figure. It was not part of the composition. It had not been noticed clearly by the photographer. And yet there it was, a man in a dark coat and bowler hat, standing alone behind the crowd, as if watching from a distance. Holmes held the photo at arm's length, then brought it close again. "Do you recognize this individual?" he asked. Atwood shook his head. "No, that is the difficulty. This image was only recently rediscovered, part of a batch we received from the estate of a late benefactor. We were preparing it for archival listing when one of my interns spotted the figure in the background. No one seems to know who he is, nor why he appears in several photographs, always in the background, always in the shadows." My ears pricked. "Several?" Atwood nodded. "Yes, Doctor, there are 4 images in which he appears, taken at different events over the course of 6 years, always at public academic gatherings, and always unnoticed at the time. Holmes smiled faintly. A connoisseur of obscure learning, perhaps, or a spectre with a library card. "Forgive me if it sounds absurd," said Atwood, visibly distressed, "but last week the same intern who noticed the figure went missing. Her name is Elsie Grimwood, bright, studious, recently accepted to the Institute's research fellowship. She vanished after leaving the archives late Wednesday evening. Scotland Yard believes it to be a simple case of a young woman overwhelmed by pressure. But I suspect, I fear, that these photographs may not be quite so innocent." Holmes leaned forward now, all languor shed like a discarded coat. His fingers tapped the table once, twice. "Have the police been made aware of the photographs?" "I gave them copies, yes, but I believe they dismissed them as coincidence. I thought perhaps your eyes might catch something theirs did not." Holmes rose and walked to the window, the photograph still in hand. The fog outside was thick enough to press its nose against the glass. "You say the images span 6 years. Same figure, roughly, same posture?" "Yes, always in the background, always with the same hat. And here is the most curious detail. None of the negatives contain him. Only the printed photographs show the man." That drew even my skeptical attention. Holmes turned sharply. "What?" Atwood cleared his throat. "The negatives. We developed them anew to see if the resolution could be improved. And in each case the man in the background was absent from the original plate. It's as though he appears only in the printed image." There was a moment of silence. The fire cracked behind us, throwing shadows onto the walls. "Mr. Atwood," Holmes said quietly, "I would like to see all the photographs. Originals, copies, negatives, and any related documentation. Watson and I shall call upon the Institute tomorrow morning." The curator looked visibly relieved. "Of course, I've brought them with me. They're in my valise downstairs." He stood, offered a short bow, and took his leave. When the door closed behind him, Holmes remained at the window, gazing into the fog like a man searching for a ship just past the horizon. "You are intrigued," I said, breaking the silence. He gave a thin smile. "Watson, when a man appears in the background of 4 unrelated photographs across 6 years, yet leaves no trace on the negative, it is not merely intriguing, it is an impossibility masquerading as coincidence." "And the missing girl?" "That," he said, turning toward me, "is the thread that will unravel the entire tapestry." It was still dark when we set off the next morning, though the mist had thinned just enough to allow the lamps to cast thin golden veins along the pavement. The cab ride to the Covington Institute took us across a city caught between sleep and stirring, its chimneys exhaling and windows still dimmed. Holmes was unusually quiet, his eyes not on the passing scenery, but fixed inward, as if sifting through a mental cabinet of faces, facts, and shadows. The Covington Institute was a brooding structure of red brick and solemn purpose, tucked behind iron gates not far from the serpentine paths of Kensington Gardens. It bore the air of a place that considered its silence a virtue and its dust a badge of intellectual honour. A stone portico greeted us with a damp solemnity, and a brass plaque beside the door simply read, "Archives and Special Collections." Percy Atwood met us at the entrance, looking somehow both hurried and hesitant. He ushered us inside without delay, his voice hushed, though there was no one about to hear him. "Her desk is just downstairs," he said. "Elsie Grimwood, bright girl, organized to a fault. I haven't touched her workspace since the day she vanished." The basement archive was a different world entirely. Stone steps descended into a low-ceilinged corridor lined with iron sconces and brittle yellow bulbs that gave off more hum than heat. The air was cold and dry, laced with the scent of parchment, mildew, and forgotten things. Rows of file cabinets stretched into shadowy alcoves, and the occasional glint of glass hinted at old photographic plates behind locked drawers. Holmes paused at the threshold. His eyes took in the scene, not in glances, but in a kind of slow, conscious absorption. He always entered a new setting like a man reading a book from the final chapter backward. "I assume nothing has been removed?" he asked. "Nothing," said Atwood. "It's all as she left it." Elsie's desk was small and neat. The surface held a closed ledger, a stub of pencil, a magnifying glass, and a pair of gloves, still creased from the last hand that wore them. A lantern on a hook above the desk had burnt out, and the shadows clung close around the corners of the space. Holmes ran a finger lightly along the edge of the table, then lifted the ledger and began flipping through it. She was categorizing a collection labeled Estate W.P. Hargrave, Atwood said quietly. "A recently donated box of photographs and personal effects. The image I showed you last night came from that set." Holmes stopped turning pages. "W.P. Hargrave," he repeated. "Is that name known to you, Watson?" I shook my head. "Not immediately." "He was an eccentric antiquarian," Atwood offered. "Lived alone, collected arcane books, peculiar artifacts and photographs, especially those of crowds. He had a fascination with anonymous gatherings, street parades, academic functions, railway platforms. Said it revealed the true face of society." Holmes made a low noise in his throat. "And in these anonymous crowds, your mysterious figure makes his recurring appearances." Atwood nodded. "Yes." Holmes reached the final pages of the ledger. His brow furrowed. He flipped back 3 pages and read something silently for a long moment, before tearing the sheet out cleanly and slipping it into his coat. Atwood blinked. "Is something wrong?" Holmes looked up. "No, merely something annotated." He crouched now and examined the space beneath the desk. A pair of boots rested neatly to the side. Holmes sniffed the air gently, then reached behind the leg of the desk and drew out a folded strip of photographic film. "Ah," he said softly, "the lost child leaves a breadcrumb." He held it toward the light and squinted. There, suspended in silver, was the same photograph we had seen the day before, but cropped to focus only on the background. The tree, the shadow, the man in the bowler hat. Only now, closer and magnified, one could just make out a curious detail, a glint where the man's left eye should be. Not the eye itself, but something metallic, perhaps a monocle or an optical device. "She was examining this closely," Holmes murmured. "Very closely indeed." He rose. "Mr. Atwood, I must ask to see the full Hargrave archive, every image, note and item from the donation." Atwood hesitated, then gestured. "This way." He led us to a locked cabinet. Inside were dozens of folders and several large cardboard boxes tied with string. Holmes untied the first and began pulling out photographs, some curled with age, others brittle as autumn leaves. One by one he set them out on the nearby table, creating a silent gallery of forgotten moments. A street preacher in Lambeth, a regatta at Cambridge, a garden party in Hampstead, each filled with faces, some laughing, some caught mid-motion, but always, somewhere in the periphery, the man in the background. His posture varied slightly, sometimes arms crossed, other times holding a rolled newspaper, but always the same clothing, the same stance of detachment, always unnoticed. Holmes studied them in sequence, his eyes narrowing. Then he turned sharply to Atwood. "Has anyone examined these images under ultraviolet light?" "No," Atwood said, surprised. "Why would we—" "Because someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to be seen only when they wish to be seen." He opened his pocketbook and made several rapid notes. Then he turned to me. "Watson, you recall the smudge on the right side of the tree in the lecture photo?" "Yes, I thought it was simply damage." "It may be, but it may also be a deliberate masking, an erasure." He tapped one of the other photographs. "This figure, he's not merely present, he's watching. Always from the same angle, always a safe distance. This is not a man caught by chance. This is a man recording." "Recording?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Perhaps not with a camera, but with his eyes, observing specific targets in public settings." Atwood looked pale. "Do you believe Miss Grimwood was targeted?" Holmes said nothing, but the look he gave the photograph suggested an answer he was not yet ready to say aloud. He collected 3 of the images and rolled them tightly. "We shall take these for further study. I will return them unharmed." Atwood nodded silently. As we made our way back into the daylight, I turned to Holmes and said, "You think this is more than an academic obsession?" Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. "I think, Watson, we are looking not at a man who intrudes upon photographs, but a man who uses them as mirrors. The question is, what is he hoping to reflect?" He paused at the gate. "And why has one of his reflections gone missing?" Our return to Baker Street was marked by silence. Holmes said nothing during the cab ride, though his fingers danced against his knee with the rhythm of a man mid-calculation. It was a tic I had come to recognize, like the flick of a telegraph key transmitting thought. He was not merely reflecting on what we had seen in the Covington archives. He was pulling threads, listening to the tension between them, deciding which one might snap first. As we mounted the steps to our flat, I dared to ask the question that had been circling my thoughts since we left the Institute. "Do you believe the girl, Miss Grimwood, uncovered something dangerous?" Holmes gave a half nod, half shrug. "She uncovered something someone preferred remain buried. Whether it is dangerous depends not on the discovery itself, but on the nature of the man behind it." Once inside, Holmes tossed the 3 selected photographs on the table as though they were playing cards. "Each of these," he said, "features our enigmatic observer, all taken at public events, spanning at least 6 years, all donated by the same collector, Hargrave. The man's presence is always peripheral, but always consistent. That is deliberate." I poured tea while Holmes turned up the gas lamps, casting a warmer light across the images. He retrieved a magnifying lens from his desk and leaned over the photos. "This one," he said, pointing, "taken at the garden party. Notice the angle of his body. His gaze is not toward the main gathering, but slightly to the left, toward a group of children." "That could be coincidence," I offered, though doubt already tingled at my spine. "Indeed," said Holmes, "coincidence is a most patient liar, Watson." He handed me the magnifier and pointed again. "Look closely at the man's coat, at the left lapel." I squinted through the lens. At first I saw only wool texture, blurred at the edges. Then something shimmered faintly beneath the grain, a small pin or insignia, just visible beneath the lapel fold. It was not decorative, but practical. "A watch chain?" I guessed. Holmes shook his head. "No, the position is wrong. That is not a timepiece. It's a lens, perhaps an early form of micro-camera, though that would require daring innovation for the period. Or it may be symbolic. Either way, our friend is not simply observing, he is cataloguing." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small parcel tied in brown paper and sealed with wax. "This just arrived by messenger, Mr. Holmes. No return address." Holmes took it gently, sniffed the paper, turned it over, and studied the seal. It was blank. He sliced it open with a letter opener. Inside was a single sheet of stiff card. Mounted at the center was a photograph. sepia-toned, slightly curled. He held it toward the lamp. I leaned in and felt my breath catch. It was an image of a narrow alley, cobbled and slick, with a single street lamp casting a triangle of light. In the center stood a figure, a young woman in a long coat, her head turned over her shoulder as if someone had called her name. Elsie Grimwood. She looked surprised, not frightened. But the photo had been taken without her knowledge, mid-motion. Behind her, partially blurred, and at the far end of the alley was a shadowed figure, the same bowler hat, the same coat. "This is recent," Holmes murmured, "perhaps within a week." "But how did it reach us?" I asked. Holmes turned the card over. On the back, written in narrow black ink, were the words, "You're not the only one watching." He placed the card carefully on the table and reached for his pipe. "This confirms what I suspected. Our stranger is not a passive anomaly. He is active, aware, and perhaps in his own twisted way, issuing a challenge." "You think he sent this?" "Without doubt. The anonymity of the delivery, the choice of image, the precise moment captured. This was no accident. It's not a threat, Watson. It's an invitation." "To what?" Holmes tapped his fingers once more. "To see him. To follow the trail not of what he's done, but of what he's building." He rose and began pacing. "We must learn more about W.P. Hargrave," he said. "Not just his collection, but his acquaintances, his interests, his travels. A man who collects images of strangers is either mad or meticulous. And if he left these photographs behind, there's reason to believe our bowler-hatted phantom once moved in Hargrave's orbit." "I can inquire with the solicitor who managed Hargrave's estate," I offered. "You handle the Institute angle. I'll trace his personal connections." Holmes nodded approvingly. "And one more thing, Watson. When you meet this solicitor, ask if any items from the estate are missing, something unlisted, something that might not have been delivered with the rest." "Why?" "Because our visitor," he said, gesturing to the photograph of Elsie, "had access to something private, either a possession of Hargrave's or something passed through Grimwood's hands. And if he is orchestrating this, then he is no mere stalker." He lit his pipe. "He is an architect of memory." The term struck me as strange, poetic even, and I saw that distant look Holmes sometimes wore when confronting the edges of rationality, a man tethered to reason yet staring into something more abstract, a pattern he could see forming but not yet define. As he turned once more to the images, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Do you think," I asked slowly, "that he wants us to find her?" Holmes didn't look up. He only said, "No, I think he wants us to look exactly where he's been standing all along, at the background." The following morning found me beneath a low, grey sky, walking the damp, cobbled streets of Bloomsbury toward the offices of Peabody and Strake solicitors. Holmes had sent me alone, preferring to remain with the photographs, where, he said, the shadow converses more freely than most men. He would consult the Royal Photographic Society in Kensington for technical insights. Meanwhile, I was to follow the trail of the dead man whose legacy had somehow become the stage for this troubling mystery. The firm occupied a narrow townhouse wedged between a stationer's and a publishing house. I was shown in by a clerk with ink-stained sleeves, who left me in a room lined with shelves of red-bound ledgers. The air smelled of beeswax polish and quiet litigation. Moments later, a small man with spectacles and thinning hair entered, clutching a notebook and bowing with the mechanical grace of someone who had done so too often. "Dr. Watson, I believe." "I'm Harold Strake. My partner is out for the week, but I oversaw the Hargrave estate personally. A peculiar case, to be sure. What can I help you with?" I explained that I was acting on behalf of Mr. Sherlock Holmes in connection with the recent disappearance of Miss Elsie Grimwood, a researcher associated with the Covington Institute, and that certain aspects of the late Mr. Hargrave's estate might prove relevant. Strake raised a pale brow at the mention of Holmes, but offered no objection. Mr. Hargrave, he said, was a recluse by most measures, no surviving family. His entire estate, aside from a modest trust to cover his burial, was bequeathed to the Covington Institute. The will was written 12 years before his death and never updated. I can provide a copy of the inventory if you'd like. That would be helpful, I said. But I'm also interested in what wasn't listed. Strake gave me a tight smile. That's always the question, isn't it? I take it you suspect something may have gone missing. Holmes's phrasing returned to me. Ask if any items from the estate are missing, something unlisted. Perhaps not missing, I replied carefully. Merely overlooked or removed before delivery. Did Mr. Hargrave keep a diary or personal correspondence? The solicitor turned toward a filing cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and extracted a slim folder. Only a few letters, he said, placing the folder on the desk. And no known diaries. He was fond of notes scribbled in margins and loose scraps tucked into books. Many of those were sent along with the collection. I glanced through the papers. One letter stood out, addressed to someone, simply signed C, dated nearly 20 years ago. The images speak, but no one listens. I believe the mechanism is memory itself. It lingers in the periphery. That is where they hide. That is where he hides. What do you make of this? I asked, handing it back. Strake frowned. We assumed it was the rambling of an aging mind. Hargrave grew increasingly isolated after the turn of the century. He spoke to no one outside a small circle of collectors. One gentleman in particular was noted as a frequent visitor, though I'm afraid the name escapes me. Was it ever recorded? Strake scratched his head. There was a note in the ledger. He moved to a second cabinet and retrieved a large volume. Leafing through with practiced fingers, he stopped at a page marked Visitors. There, he said, tapping the entry. Only one recurring name in the last 5 years of Hargrave's life, Mr. L. Darren, no address recorded. Visited on the 3rd Thursday of each month, like clockwork. No mention of him in the will, nothing else. I copied the name down. Would you be willing to share the delivery log for the estate materials passed to the Institute? Strake nodded. Certainly. He produced another sheaf of documents and ran a finger down a neatly itemized list. Books, boxes of photographs, lantern slides, tintypes, notes, and miscellaneous effects. I interrupted. Was there any object sealed or wrapped separately? Strake paused. Yes, box H, as I recall. Heavy, delivered by special courier at the client's request. I signed it over personally. Do you know what it contained? No. We were instructed not to open it. By Hargrave? By Hargrave's written instructions. He was very particular. About box H, said it was to be delivered last and under no examination. I wrote the designation down. And the box was received? Signed for by a Mr. Atwood. I can show you the receipt. No need. That confirms it. Something in my tone must have caught his ear. Dr. Watson, forgive me, but should I be concerned? If the Institute is in danger? I stood and shook his hand. I cannot say for certain, but it's no longer merely a question of forgotten heirlooms. Outside, the fog had begun to return, thick and slow. I turned up my collar and hailed a cab. The name Eldarin rolled through my mind like a coin between fingers. A regular visitor. No address. No trace. I was halfway back to Baker Street when I felt the prickle. Something not quite right. The cab had slowed, but we were nowhere near a crossing. I leaned forward. Driver? No reply. The horse stood still, breath clouding the air. I opened the door. There, standing at the corner beneath a crooked street lamp, was a man. Coat bowler hat, facing away. For a moment I froze, then he turned, not fully, just enough for his profile to catch the light. It was the face from the photographs. And he was smiling. I stepped out quickly, but as I approached, he vanished into the alley beside the tobacconist's. I turned the corner just seconds behind him, but it was empty. No footsteps, no shadow. I returned to the cab, breath quickened. Holmes would need to hear this. And I, though I am not a man prone to fancy, could not shake the feeling that the photograph had blinked first. By the time I reached Baker Street, the clouds had descended like theatre drapery over London, casting the city in a twilight gloom well before supper. The lamplighters were already at their work, and the glow of our sitting-room window shone like a beacon through the fog. I climbed the stairs with uncharacteristic haste, the image of that smiling figure still vivid in my mind, his presence lingering like a smudge on the lens of memory. Holmes was exactly where I had left him, seated cross-legged in the armchair, a magnifying lens in one hand, and the now familiar photograph in the other. A second photograph, one of the new prints, enlarged and redeveloped, rested on the table, still curling at the edges from the drying process, and the air smelled faintly of chemical fixative. "You're late," he said, without looking up. "I had a visitor," I replied, removing my coat. He raised an eyebrow, but still did not glance in my direction. "At the solicitor's office. Outside, near the tobacconist at Portland Place. Our man, Holmes, the bowler-hatted phantom. I saw him with my own eyes. He was watching. And when I moved to approach, he vanished." Holmes laid down his lens. For a moment he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, "So he steps from the frame?" I believe he was following me. "No, Watson," he said, rising now and moving to the fireplace. "He was presenting himself. Marking your awareness. When the fox begins to circle the hunter's boot print, it is not confusion, it is calculation. I gave him the name I had gleaned from the solicitor's log, Mr. Eldarin, and watched his brow furrow at the sound of it. "Darin?" he echoed. "A name with no footprint. I've checked the registry, property rolls, society lists and directories, no listing in London or its surrounding counties. It is, as yet, a name without substance." "What of the box?" "Box H, the one Hargrave insisted be delivered sealed." Holmes turned toward his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Atwood confirmed its arrival, but claims it was empty when opened. A shipping error, perhaps. Or so he says." "Do you believe him?" Holmes hesitated. "I believe he thinks he is telling the truth, but I also believe someone may have intercepted the box, either en route or upon delivery. A substitution. For what purpose?" He tapped the edge of the photograph on the mantel. "To remove the one item that shouldn't be archived, or perhaps should never have been unearthed at all." I sank into my chair, the weariness of the day settling across my shoulders. "And what have you discovered?" I asked. Holmes gestured toward the new photograph on the table. It was a side-by-side overlay of two images, the garden party and the lecture crowd. In both, the mysterious figure was marked with a faint red pin. Same height, same stance, same bearing, but the details differ slightly. The collar is higher in one, the coat's hem longer in another. The shadow always falls to the left, even when the lighting direction should suggest otherwise. I looked more closely. "It's as though he's been composited in," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "Exactly. These are not natural artifacts of exposure. Someone has altered the negatives or the prints to include him. And if your encounter today is to be believed, Watson, then our man is more than a ghost of emulsion." I stared at the image. But why go to such lengths to appear in the background of photographs, to haunt archival shadows? Holmes reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope. From it, He removed a folded sheet of paper and handed it to me. While you were with the solicitor, I visited the Royal Photographic Society. One of the archivists recalled Hargrave, said he was obsessed with a theory. He called it contextual memory imprinting. The idea that events, objects, even people leave psychic residues in imagery. That the background of a photograph, its unnoticed corners, contains unconscious memory more truthfully than posed subjects ever could. I scanned the note. He watches from the edge, not to be seen, but to witness. We stare at the subject. He stares at us. Holmes added, Hargrave believed that a person could reveal themselves more completely by appearing invisibly. The stranger in the background says more about the event than the man giving the speech. I exhaled slowly. You think our man has adopted this theory? I think he's turned it into doctrine. He doesn't want to be noticed. He wants to exist in the moment without participation, like a parasite of perception. We sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling, the gaslights humming. Then Holmes stood abruptly. There is one thread we've left dangling. And that is? Miss Grimwood? He stepped over to his bureau and retrieved the original cropped photo of Elsie in the alley. With careful hands, he slipped it into a folder along with the rest. She vanished on a Wednesday evening. Her boarding house records confirm she signed out at 6:15 p.m. for her usual route home, but she never arrived. No known disturbances, no cries for help. Only this image, arriving days later, sent anonymously, showing her mid-turn. He looked directly at me now, his voice low. Watson, what if she wasn't taken? What if she followed him? You mean voluntarily? No, not willingly, but drawn. He may have revealed himself to her, not just as a figure in a photograph, but in the flesh. And she, being curious, followed the frame. The frame? Holmes paced again. She lived in a world of catalogued images, prints, negatives, glass plates. She understood the language of shadows and grain. If our man whispered to her in that language, offered her a thread to pull, she may have stepped through the lens without realizing it. It was an unsettling metaphor. But in Holmes's world, metaphor often rode alongside fact. What do we do now? We visit her boarding house. We reconstruct her final walk. And if we're fortunate, he paused at the window, peering into the fogged street below. We find the point where the photograph turned from image into invitation. We left Baker Street under the hush of early evening, the fog once again thickening in folds as though London were cloaking herself against what might be seen too clearly. Holmes, bundled tightly in his Inverness cape, moved like a man tethered to a single thread in the dark, tracing it with invisible fingers. I followed close behind, notebook in my pocket, revolver under my coat, though I scarcely knew what threat I expected to face. Our destination, the modest boarding house in Pimlico, where Miss Elsie Grimwood had last been seen alive. The building stood along a row of similar brick dwellings, 3 stories tall, with soot-streaked windows and wrought-iron railings that wept rust into the pavement below. A single gas lamp flickered at the corner, casting dull light across the entryway. Holmes knocked briskly. After a moment, a woman in her middle years, with hair bound in a severe coil and spectacles on a chain, opened the door. "Yes?" she asked, eyeing us with suspicion. Holmes produced a card. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are inquiring about Miss Elsie Grimwood, who lodged here." Her expression did not soften, but she stepped aside to let us in. "You're not the first," she muttered. "Scotland Yard came sniffing round last week. Found nothing." The parlour into which we were shown was tidy but sparse. smelling faintly of boiled cabbage and floor wax. A ticking wall clock counted out the seconds with mechanical indifference. Holmes remained standing. "When did you last see Miss Grimwood?" he asked. The landlady folded her arms. "Wednesday last, same as I told the constable. She came down at 6:15, coat buttoned, scarf knotted, and carrying a small envelope under her arm. Said she was heading home from the Institute, as usual." "Did she seem nervous, distracted?" "She was quiet, but she always was, except that night she hesitated on the threshold, turned back and asked me if we still had that old camera upstairs." "Camera?" Holmes asked quickly. "A box brownie. Belonged to a student who boarded here years ago, left it behind. Miss Grimwood said she wanted to borrow it for just one evening. I told her she could, but she never came back for it." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "May I see her room?" The landlady led us up the narrow stairs. The hallway carpet was worn thin at the centre, and the banister creaked under our hands. Elsie's room was the second door on the right, small, with a single bed, desk, and a curtained window that overlooked a quiet alley. Holmes moved like a hound picking up scent. He opened drawers without hesitation, ran his hands along the underside of the writing desk, and examined the window-sill where flakes of white paint curled like old parchment. I, meanwhile, stepped to the shelf above the bed. There, tucked between two dog-eared copies of popular photography and a battered edition of the Moonstone, I found a folded scrap of paper. Holmes was at my side in an instant. I handed it to him. It was a hand-drawn map, sketched hastily in pencil. Not a full street plan, but a fragment, a few intersecting lanes, a notation of "gas lamp out" scrawled at the corner, and a single circle drawn over what appeared to be a dead-end alley. No names, no dates, just the penciled direction. He always turns right. "She was tracking him," I said, voice low. Holmes nodded. "And preparing?" The envelope the landlady saw, perhaps it contained a print or a note to someone she trusted. Perhaps she thought she could lure him out. He turned back to the window. "Watson, look!" I stepped beside him. Across the narrow alley stood a tenement block, its windows curtained, but one window, on the third floor, was cracked open, its curtain shifting slightly with the draught. Hanging from the sash was a strip of something white, not fabric, paper. Holmes strode from the room without a word. I followed as he descended the stairs with uncharacteristic speed and exited into the night. We crossed the alleyway and entered the opposite building, an older residence converted to flats. The main door was unlocked. Holmes climbed swiftly to the third floor and knocked on the door opposite the window. No answer. He knocked again, sharper this time. Still silence. With a glance back at me, he produced a slender tool from his pocket, and, with the efficiency of a man long unburdened by legal restraint in matters of urgency, opened the lock with two deft motions. We stepped inside. The room was dark. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by the slight breeze drifting through the open window. The white strip we saw now was a photographic slide, pinned by the sash to flutter like a banner. Holmes pulled it in gently. On it was a portrait, not of Elsie, but of a man, middle-aged, impassive, staring directly at the lens. It was damaged, the emulsion scratched, but the outline of the coat and hat were unmistakable. "The background man," I whispered. Holmes held it to the light, examining the shadows behind the figure. "Look there," he said, pointing to a blurred figure behind the subject, almost a second face, barely formed, but eerily similar. A repetition, a trick of exposure, or something more deliberate. Then Holmes stepped forward into the room. On the far wall was a pinned display, rows of photographs, notes, and more sketches like the one we'd found. And at the centre, dominating all, was a print of the same lecture image we had seen at the Institute. Only now the man in the background had been cut out with a scalpel, leaving a hollow silhouette like a man-shaped wound in the paper. "She made this," Holmes said softly. "This was her watchtower, her own archive." I turned slowly, feeling a growing tension between reverence and dread. This was no longer the domain of archivists and scholars. This was something deeper, a pursuit bordering on obsession, a silent war fought in exposure times and margins. And then Holmes froze. From beneath the pinned photos he drew a single torn page. It was a letter, unfinished, written in Elsie Grimwood's hand. "If you find this, then I have followed him. I don't know where it leads, but he is not just in the background. He is the background, the silence, the part we ignore. He told me, memory is a room, and he is the door." We stood in the boarding house flat like men who had arrived too late to a séance, surrounded not by ghosts, but by their careful invitations. The wall of photographs stared back at us, patient and unreadable, each pinned with precision and arranged like constellations in a forgotten sky. Holmes examined every inch of the display with hands behind his back and brows drawn low, not in confusion, but in concentration, like a man trying to remember a word he knows he never learned. "She's crossed into the same pursuit," he said at last. "Pursuit of what?" I asked. "The man, or the idea of him." Holmes turned, his face half-shadowed. She understood that he wasn't merely appearing in photographs, he was curating his presence in them, choosing where to stand, how much to reveal, how little to distort the scene. The photographs are not evidence of his existence, they are tools, language. He plucked a smaller print from the lower corner of the board, an image of a woman crossing the street in front of a cafe. Behind her, the familiar outline, coat, hat, posture, always watching, always still. "She marked this one," Holmes said, pointing to a faint circle made in red pencil. "But not around him, around a figure behind him, almost entirely obscured." I stepped forward. "Another face?" Holmes nodded. "A woman, possibly a reflection in the window, but it's partially visible through his outline, as if the exposure had been altered unnaturally." "So he's blocking something." "No," Holmes replied. "He's revealing something." He moved to the corner of the room where a shoebox sat beneath the desk. Inside, dozens of glass negatives, carefully stacked with tissue between them. Holmes selected one and held it to the lamplight. It showed a railway platform at dusk. Blurred figures moved toward the edge of the frame, but there again, near the middle ground, stood the man in the bowler hat. Holmes compared the negative to its corresponding print on the wall. Then he stopped breathing. "Watson," he said slowly, "he isn't on the negative." I looked closely. He was right. On the print, the man stood plainly among the crowd, but on the negative, he was absent. Holmes placed the two side by side on the desk, angling them to catch the light. "It's not a case of faint exposure or poor development. He does not exist on the raw capture." "But how is that possible?" Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "Someone has inserted him into the prints after development. Not by modern means, of course, but by manipulating layers, double exposures, or altering chemical stages. A master technician could do it, particularly if their aim wasn't to deceive in the foreground, but merely to be present in the background." I paced, hands behind my back, staring at the curling edges of the prints. But who would go to such trouble? For what end? Holmes picked up another glass plate. "There is method in it, repetition, strategy. Consider, we now have over half a dozen instances of this man appearing in settings ranging from university events to public crossings. The environments are unrelated, yet the compositions, his distance, his angle, his obscurity, are consistent, as if part of a design. Perhaps Hargrave was doing it. No, Holmes said. Hargrave collected these images, but the technique surpasses his ability. That's why he fixated on the theory of contextual memory imprinting. He knew something was present he couldn't explain. Something stitched into the periphery. I hesitated, then said what had been troubling me since the boarding house. And what of Miss Grimwood's last note? He is not just in the background, he is the background. What did she mean by that? Holmes turned toward me, then did something I hadn't seen him do in weeks. He sat, and for a moment he looked weary. She meant, he said slowly, then that this figure isn't hiding in the shadows. He is the shadows. She saw the pattern, Watson. The man was never the subject, never even fully part of the scene. He existed to shape the context, to shift meaning without notice. A background figure can affect emotion, tension, perception, without ever being questioned. He manipulates the frame of memory itself. A silence followed, thick and uneasy. I remembered my own glimpse of him, across the street, beneath the gas lamp. The feeling that he had stepped out of something, not merely into my line of sight, but out of a space where he had always been present and had only now decided to be visible. Holmes stood again. We must visit the print lab at Covington. Tonight? There's no time for comfort, Watson. I believe Box H, the sealed box, contained more than just photographs. It contained the original developing tools, perhaps even the lens. Whatever device or method our man used, Grimwood may have uncovered it. And the figure you think you saw in the photo behind him could be another victim or another participant. We descended the stairs with purpose, Holmes moving fast enough that I had to double my pace to match. Outside, the fog had drawn in close, as if eager to eavesdrop. The street lamp flickered once as we passed, and somewhere in the mist a carriage rumbled like distant thunder. As we reached the end of the street, I turned, without knowing why. There, at the far end of the block, a figure stood beneath the edge of a building. Still. Bowler hat, long coat, watching. I touched Holmes's sleeve, but when he turned, the figure stepped back into the shadow, vanishing between one blink and the next. He's accelerating, Holmes murmured. What do you mean? I mean, he said, not looking away from the place where the man had stood, that we've nearly reached the center of the frame. We arrived at the Covington Institute under cover of darkness, the lamplight dim and the streets emptied of all but the occasional constable making his rounds. The grand facade loomed against the night like a sleeping colossus. A single light glowed in a rear window, the photography lab, where Percy Atwood had agreed to meet us. The man had shown hesitation when Holmes requested the meeting, but he did not refuse. One did not generally refuse Holmes, not out of fear, but because he asked as though the request had already been granted. Atwood opened the side door promptly at our arrival. His coat was thrown hastily over his waistcoat, and his spectacles hung slightly crooked on his nose. "I assume this is urgent?" he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Holmes nodded. "We need access to every item from Box H, including the ones you didn't understand." "I told you," Atwood said, leading us through a narrow hallway lined with cabinets. "The box was empty when I opened it, or rather, there were materials, but no inventory matched them. Old lenses, bits of brass, broken film cartridges, nothing usable." Holmes said nothing until we entered the dark room. The air within was warm and chemical sour, thick with the scent of developer and stop bath. Red lamps glowed from the corners like watchful eyes. Shelves were stacked with trays, cloths, and photographic plates. At the center of the space stood a single table, on which rested a lacquered wooden box, long and flat. Holmes moved toward it immediately. You didn't find this significant? He asked, running his fingers along its edge. Atwood shrugged. It didn't seem relevant. No lenses inside, just two compartments, one with negatives, one with fragments. Holmes opened it. Inside, divided by thin wooden partitions, were 6 glass negatives and a velvet pouch containing a circular object no larger than a crown coin. Holmes lifted it carefully. It was a lens, but not like any I'd seen, darkened at the edges, almost smoked in appearance, with a faint swirl pattern etched into the glass. He held it to the red light, squinting through. "Curious?" he murmured. "May I?" I asked. He passed it to me. Looking through, the world dimmed, but not simply in brightness. The edges of the room seemed to bend inward, the corners stretching like fabric. Atwood's shadow on the wall trembled slightly, though the man himself stood still. "It distorts the periphery," I said. Holmes nodded. "Not a camera lens, Watson, a viewing lens." "For what purpose?" "That," Holmes said, "is precisely what we must determine." He set the lens aside and unwrapped the 6 negatives, laying them on a white cloth in the red light. Each depicted a seemingly ordinary scene, an alleyway, a train station, a reading room, a bridge. But in each there were peculiar details. One showed a blurred figure, so blurred, in fact, that the edges had begun to dissolve into the scenery. Another had 2 shadows cast by a single figure. A third showed a man in a bowler hat, and behind him, in a reflection in the glass of a shop window, the same man again, only facing the other way. Atwood leaned closer. These were part of the Hargrave donation, but we assumed they were either damaged or misdeveloped. The Institute didn't keep many from the set. Holmes pointed at the train station image. "This is King's Cross. Look at the clock, 3:14 p.m. Note the platform number, 7. That places the event on the 14th of April, 1893. I was there that afternoon. I remember the storm." He handed the negative to Atwood. "Enlarge this one. Print it." Atwood obeyed, moving with careful, practiced hands. The red light deepened as he worked, the image slowly forming in the developer bath, its shadowy outlines swimming toward clarity. And then Holmes stepped forward. "Stop! Bring the light closer." We peered over the edge of the tray. In the lower corner of the print, just beyond the crowd waiting on the platform, stood the unmistakable silhouette, coat, hat, hands folded behind his back. The stranger. But that wasn't all. Behind him, just visible, was a woman's face in profile, not looking at him but through him. Or perhaps, more disturbingly, she seemed unaware of his presence entirely. Holmes's voice was low. "That's Miss Grimwood." I leaned in, heart quickening. But if this was taken over a year ago, I wouldn't have even joined the Institute yet. Holmes's face remained unreadable. She may have stumbled across older images where she appeared without ever having been present, and it drew her in. A person seeing themselves where they could not possibly be, that would be enough to inspire obsession, or fear, or both. Atwood looked confused. "You're suggesting these photographs aren't capturing events, they're constructing them." "Or perhaps curating them," Holmes said. "Whoever our background man is, he's not merely a voyeur, he is an editor of reality, or at the very least, of memory." We stood in silence a moment. Then Holmes spoke again. "I need a light box and the 5th drawer from that cabinet." Atwood retrieved the requested items while Holmes took the developing print and compared it against another from Elsie's wall. The match was perfect. Same day, different angle. She had already seen herself in this image, and she had marked the stranger's presence, circled it in blue pencil. She was following him through time, Holmes whispered. Not through movement, but through arrangement. As if tracing a story told entirely in side glances. I found myself glancing toward the red glow of the darkroom bulb, my mind turning over like gears too worn to catch. "What is he, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer directly. He picked up the lens once more, stared through it into the darkness of the lab, and said, "He is the space between the moment and its recollection. And I fear, unless we reach her first, Miss Grimwood is being written into his archive." Holmes remained fixed in place, staring through the mysterious lens as though its curved surface revealed the logic behind the world's disjointed memories. The red light of the darkroom reflected in the glass, turning his eye a dull ember, and for a moment he did not move. Atwood hovered nearby, clearly unsettled, his arms drawn tightly around himself, as if bracing against a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "He's not merely capturing moments," Holmes said at last, lowering the lens with a measured slowness. "He's orchestrating them. He has learned how to position himself in time and place, not simply to be present, but to alter perception retroactively." "Alter perception?" I echoed. "You mean to tamper with the memory of events?" Holmes nodded, gathering up the newly printed photograph of the train platform and placing it beside the others. A background figure, unexamined, invisible to conscious focus, yet always there. The subconscious registers it. Over time, a memory becomes inextricable from the images associated with it. This man, whoever he is, knows that once he appears in those images, he becomes part of the remembered reality, even if he was never there. He turned to Atwood. "I need to see the complete catalogue of the Hargrave collection, original arrangement. Not the curated, alphabetized version you showed me before, the raw chronological sequence as Hargrave kept it." Atwood hesitated. "That would take time to retrieve. It's still in the basement archive." Holmes glanced at the wall clock. "Then we must go now." Now?" Atwood looked visibly reluctant. "Yes," Holmes said crisply, already removing his gloves. "Because our phantom does not operate in chaos. He uses order. He repeats. If we can determine the full structure of his appearances, the logic behind which photographs he chose to enter, we may find a pattern, perhaps even a destination." A few minutes later, we found ourselves descending once more into the Covington Institute's sub-levels, the walls narrowing, the air turning stale. The electric light bulbs down here buzzed faintly, casting a yellow wash over the shelves of documents and film canisters. It had the hush of a tomb, not in disrepair, but preserved too long, untouched by anything save the rustle of paper and thought. Atwood led us to a wooden cabinet sealed with an iron clasp. He unlocked it, pulled out a stack of ledgers and opened one to the middle, revealing Hargrave's handwritten logs, dense, looping script, interspersed with symbols. Holmes scanned the pages quickly, then stopped. "Here," he said. "Notice the date sequence, April 14th, 1893, the same day as the train platform image." He flipped through several more pages. "And here again, July 3rd, 1896, appears in 3 separate negatives from unrelated locations. Hargrave noticed it too. He's marked them with a small crescent." "A signature?" I asked. "Possibly a cipher, more likely a flag, a pattern emerging." He turned sharply to Atwood. "How many total images contain the figure?" Atwood looked flustered. I'm not sure, at least 15, possibly more." Holmes began pacing. "And of those, how many are tied to missing individuals?" The room fell still. I don't know." "Start cross-referencing immediately," Holmes said, turning to me. "Watson, we must consider a possibility both outlandish and necessary, that the man we pursue, this background phantom, is not acting alone, that there is a mechanism, or perhaps a location, which allows him to engineer these intersections between presence and memory." A location? I asked. You mean a physical place? Yes, he replied. Somewhere where all threads converge, a stage behind the photograph, a site where images are not simply taken, but written. If Miss Grimwood followed him, that may be where she was drawn. He rifled through the pages, stopping suddenly at a sketch Hargrave had drawn. A floor plan of a circular structure. Windows around the outer edge. A domed ceiling. The notes beneath read, "Entry requires proper lens alignment. Reflection opens the corridor, a single step backward, then vanishes." Holmes's voice dropped. "The archive room." "What is it?" "A rumour among obsessive collectors. A private studio Hargrave was said to have built, or found, sometime in the 1880s. No known address, but it is referenced repeatedly in these notes. A place where the boundary between image and recollection could be manipulated. A sanctuary for the observer, not the observed." Atwood stepped back. "If it exists, I've never seen it." "No," Holmes said, "but someone has." He turned to me. "Watson, how long would it take you to retrieve the letter we found in Miss Grimwood's wall display, the unfinished note?" "Half an hour," I said. "We left it in the flat." "Do so now. Bring it to the print technician here. I believe she left an embedded clue in the language, coordinates of a kind." I hesitated, unsure of leaving Holmes alone. He saw it. "I will not go alone, I assure you. Atwood will remain with me, and I doubt our friend will strike now, not while the game still favours his illusion." I departed at once, coat trailing behind me. The fog had thinned, but the city seemed to press in on me from all sides. London had grown claustrophobic these last few days, not in space, but in vision. Every corner felt framed, every pedestrian a potential silhouette. When I returned some 40 minutes later, the atmosphere in the archive had changed. Holmes stood stiffly beside the large table, holding the envelope I had just handed him. Atwood was seated, flipping through a stack of photographs, his face pale. "You were right," Atwood murmured. "She wrote it as a cipher." Holmes unfolded the letter, then placed it beside one of Hargrave's older maps. The phrasing lined up with angular notations. The room referenced not merely space, but coordinates. Each sentence was a direction. "She was triangulating it," Holmes whispered. "Triangulating what?" Holmes looked up, the flicker of cold fire in his eyes now burning more brightly. "The archive room. I know where it is." The coordinates led us to Limehouse. Not to a grand location, nor any structure of historical record, but to a forgotten warehouse near the wharves, a slate-grey husk of brick and riveted iron that slouched beside the river like an abandoned thought. We arrived just before midnight, the fog pooling in the cracks of the street and gathering in our lungs. Holmes walked several paces ahead, trench coat fluttering like a torn page in the wind, the leather case under his arm containing the viewing lens, the letter, and 3 of the manipulated photographs. I followed, revolver holstered at my side, not because I believed bullets would be needed, but because one carries steel when the world begins to unravel. Holmes had said it best in the cab. A man stepping between memory and moment is not immune to harm, but immune to being noticed. That is what makes him dangerous. The warehouse stood unlit, windows blind with grime. A single side door remained intact, and Holmes tested the handle. Locked. But the padlock was old, flaked with rust, and Holmes made short work of it with a slender pick. The bolt slipped free with a metallic sigh. We stepped inside. The air within was still and cold, not the cold of winter, but of disuse. It carried the scent of aged film, mildew, and something faintly chemical, like old developer fluid, or the acrid breath of mothballed photographs. Our footsteps echoed through the great interior, which had once stored cargo, no doubt, but now held nothing save for shapes in the dark. Holmes held up a lantern, its warm glow pushing the shadows back inch by inch. Near the far wall was a doorway, arched and brick-lined, leading into a smaller structure built within the warehouse itself. A room inside a room. There was no knob, no keyhole, just a mirror. An oval frame, gilt edges tarnished, stood embedded in the door's surface. It was not merely decorative, it was integral, a mirror as barrier. It reflected our lantern's glow faintly, but the image was distorted, as if the glass were wet beneath its surface. Holmes withdrew the strange lens from his coat and stepped forward. "Hargrave's note was clear," he murmured. Reflection opens the corridor. He lifted the lens to his eye and looked into the mirror. Nothing happened. Then the reflection shifted. No longer did it show the two of us standing in the gloom of the warehouse, but instead a narrow corridor bathed in yellow light, books stacked along the walls, picture frames leaning haphazardly, an oil lamp hanging overhead, swaying though no wind stirred. Holmes did not hesitate. He reached forward, and the mirror rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. He stepped through. I followed without a word. The transition was silent. No sound, no resistance. One moment I stood in the warehouse. The next, I was in the archive room. It was not grand. It was not even large, but it felt profoundly intentional. The air here was different, stiller than still, as though each breath had been measured before we arrived. The corridor Holmes had seen in the mirror extended only 10 paces ahead. At its end was a circular room, domed ceiling overhead, gaslight fixtures flickering as though alive. The walls were covered not in books, but in photographs. Dozens, hundreds, every one mounted meticulously, each labelled with the place, date, and, sometimes, circumstance. Reading room, June 1891. Botanical lecture, Feb 1889. Railway departure, Oct 1892. Holmes moved toward them slowly, his eyes scanning left to right, like reading a library of ghosts. And in nearly every photograph, there he was, the man in the background, sometimes clearer, sometimes a silhouette. In some, he stood among crowds, in others, alone, always with his back turned or his profile offered, as if daring the eye to follow but never meet him. Then we saw her, Elsie Grimwood, not in just one photograph, but in 3. First, standing near a museum exhibit, staring directly at the camera. Then seated on a park bench beside an elderly woman who had been blurred entirely. And last, most recent, a photograph of a narrow alley. The same alley we had seen in the anonymous print sent to Holmes. But in this one, she was no longer turning her head in surprise. She was walking toward the lens. Holmes froze. I moved beside him. "She's here," I said, my voice cracking with something that hovered between hope and dread. "Somewhere within this collection." Holmes turned slowly to the center of the room. There, positioned beneath the dome, stood a camera. Old, box-style, mounted on a brass tripod. Worn with use, but not decay. Behind it, a velvet curtain, and beside the curtain, a single chair. Empty. Holmes approached it with caution. He did not touch the camera. He examined it, bending slightly, running his hand above the wood, never making contact. "This is the lens used to compose the illusion," he said softly. "To place the figure where he was not, or perhaps to capture what should not be there." He turned to the curtain. "Behind here lies the rest of it." "Holmes, wait." But he'd already moved. He drew the curtain aside. It revealed not a passage, but another wall of photographs, this time more chaotic, torn, scratched, overlapping. All images of the same spaces seen earlier, repeats, variants, and there, half covered by another print, was a close-up of Elsie Grimwood's face, eyes wide, mid-turn, frozen. But what struck me, what chilled my blood, was what stood behind her, a figure, but not the man we had seen before. This one wore no hat. His face was a blurred version of hers, as if... "She's being overwritten," Holmes said, voice barely audible. "What?" He looked at me, eyes dark as the lens in his coat pocket. "He's using her image, not erasing her, replacing her." We stood in silence, the photographs whispering their invisible language around us. Then from the corridor behind, the one we'd entered, came a sound, a footstep, measured, slow, followed by another, and then a voice, low, gentle, but unmistakably near. "You stepped through the frame, Mr. Holmes." The voice came not as a threat, but as a soft acknowledgement, spoken like the second half of a conversation already in progress. "You stepped through the frame, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned slowly. I followed suit, drawing my revolver without flourish, but with intention. The narrow corridor behind us, empty only minutes ago, now framed a silhouette. The figure stepped forward, his gait unhurried, his posture impeccable. The bowler hat, the long dark coat, the hands folded behind the back, and beneath the brim of that hat, the face, at last, fully visible. It was unremarkable. That was the most chilling part. He bore no scar, no mark of distinction. Not young, not old, the sort of face one would forget even as one looked at it. A man sculpted for obscurity. Eyes pale, almost translucent, set deep beneath brows that cast no shadow. Holmes did not speak. Instead, he observed. His posture told me everything here stood, the moment he had tracked through newspaper clippings, archival prints, whispers from missing persons. And now it stood before him, alive, tangible, and speaking in the voice of a librarian discussing overdue volumes. The man stopped just within the edge of the light, careful not to cast his shadow fully into the archive room. "You've seen it, then?" he said. "The collection." Holmes remained still. "We've seen enough." "You think this is about disappearance?" the man continued. "But it's not. It never was. This is preservation. All of it. Memory is a fragile currency, Mr. Holmes. Paper degrades. Names are misremembered. But a background is eternal, unchallenged." Holmes finally spoke. "You manipulate memory by becoming part of its frame. You've inserted yourself into photographs retroactively, attached your image like an afterthought to history." "No," said the man, almost mournfully. "I am the afterthought, that's the point. The details we overlook shape the meaning more than the subject ever could." He stepped closer. The light struck his coat, revealing fibers that shimmered faintly, not with ornament, but with a fabric that absorbed light like fog absorbs sound. "I stood behind a boy as his father promised him he'd return," he said. "I stood behind a woman the moment before she decided to disappear. And yes, I stood behind Elsie. She sought me out. Thought she could outwatch the watcher, but she misunderstood." Holmes's voice was flat. "Where is she?" The man tilted his head slightly. "She's here. With me." I raised my revolver. "Alive?" "She chose to remain," he replied. "The moment you step through the frame, you do not return unchanged. She saw the truth of memory, that to observe is to influence. And she chose to stay, as witness." "You forced her," I growled. He turned his eyes to me, and for the first time I felt a chill, not of the body, but of the mind. "Did I?" She followed the path herself. The mirror, the images, the lens. I did not drag her. I only remained where I had always been. Holmes took a step forward. "You think yourself some archivist of mankind, some ghost of recorded moments, But you're nothing of the kind. You're a parasite of narrative, a thief who trades in unearned presents. The man's lips curled in what might have been a smile. And yet I remain. The crowd always forgets the speaker, but they remember the room. They remember the light, the crack in the plaster, the shadow crossing behind. He turned now, gesturing to the hundreds of photographs lining the archive room walls. "Look," he said softly. The world reduced to a silent record, the same faces, the same streets, and always the witness in the distance. I've watched more lives than you can count. And I remain because I do not matter, and those who do not matter, last. Holmes moved to the central camera. "This device, this is how you've altered them?" "It's not the camera," the man replied, "but the process, the lens, the reflection, the timing. A moment captured just off-center becomes memory's anchor. You understand this already. Why else would you search through archives for truth?" He gestured to Holmes's coat. "You've brought the viewing lens." Holmes did not answer, but I could see his hand shift within the pocket that held it. "You could see it too," the man said gently. "See what she saw, the deeper context, the truth that lies behind the subject, a world that always turns away so you never see its spine." I stepped forward. "Where is she?" He looked at me. Then slowly, without menace, he reached into his coat and produced a single photograph. He held it toward me. I took it. It was Elsie Grimwood, standing alone in the circular archive room, one hand resting on the back of the empty chair, the other raised to her lips in a gesture of warning, or perhaps farewell. "She isn't imprisoned," the man said. "She's recorded, preserved in the last moment before you arrived." Holmes studied him. "And what of you? Are you preserved too, or is this the final moment before you vanish?" The man exhaled softly. "I was never here." And then he stepped backward, into the corridor. The gaslight behind us sputtered. I moved quickly, but Holmes caught my arm. "No," he said. "Let him go." I stared. "What?" "He can't be followed," Holmes whispered. "Not through a hallway, not even through time. He only exists when we aren't looking directly. If we chase him now, we'll lose everything else." Holmes turned back to the archive room. "He doesn't fear death. He fears being seen." We stood there for another long moment. The gas lamps flickered once more, then steadied. The chair at the center of the room was still empty. But something in the air had shifted, slightly warmer, slightly more human. The sense of being watched had passed. I turned again to the photograph in my hand. Elsie, frozen but calm. Holmes stepped beside me. "She left it for us, this image, as a warning, yes, but also as a key." "To what?" "To the way back." The photograph of Elsie Grimwood remained in my hand as Holmes paced the archive room, his steps slow, deliberate, echoing softly off the domed ceiling. Around us, the walls were still papered with lives interrupted. Public squares, rail depots, lecture halls, all scenes captured just wide enough to include the man who had now vanished behind the corridor's bend. The man who was never there, and yet had shaped so much by standing just behind everything. Elsie's image, however, did not speak of despair. Her posture, upright, composed, and that gesture, a hand raised near her lips, did not seem frightened but intentional, as if signaling something to us. A gesture preserved like a clue tucked within a letter's margins. Holmes halted abruptly beneath the central gas lamp. Its flicker lit only half his face, the other half drawn in the subtle folds of thought. "She left herself behind," he murmured. I turned. "She's frozen in the photograph." "Not frozen," he corrected. "Fixed, like an exposure held just before development. Not erased, not overlaid like the others. That tells us something." she anticipated this? She knew he would try to overwrite her presence, to use her image, as he had done with so many others. But she was clever. She prepared her own capture outside of his process. That final photograph, it is a kind of seal. I frowned. A seal? Holmes paced back to the viewing lens he had brought, still resting in its velvet pouch atop the camera table. She studied the apparatus, the timing. She must have discovered that the archive room wasn't simply entered, it was imprinted upon. Each new visitor added another layer of memory, but only if they entered passively, only if they allowed him to direct the frame. He lifted the lens once more. Elsie composed her own image. She turned herself from subject into archivist. She left a memory too fixed to be overwritten. I nodded slowly, understanding dawning. She made herself the last page, the final layer. Holmes held the lens toward the wall of photographs and gazed through it. Then he stopped. "There," he said softly. "Her image is fading." I looked where he pointed. One of the images, previously clear, was beginning to grey at the edges. Elsie, seated on the park bench, her outline becoming smudged. Behind her, the man's silhouette grew more distinct, as if absorbing her into the backdrop. "He's rewriting her." Holmes turned to me, voice steady. "Then we must fix her image in return." "What do we need?" He glanced toward the old brass camera, then back to the photograph in my hand. A photograph requires 3 things to survive: light, composition, and witness. She has the first 2. We must be the third. Without another word, he moved toward the camera at the center of the room and adjusted its angle. This entire room functions like a memory trap. We will photograph her photograph, but we will do so using his device. We imprint a memory of her within his archive, one step removed from his control. A photograph of a photograph, a frame beyond his reach. I steadied the image in my hand, placing it gently on the velvet backdrop before the lens. Holmes operated the camera with reverence, as though conducting a ritual. The shutter clicked once, a soft whir followed, and then silence. We developed the print in the solution Elsie herself had catalogued in her notes, marked with a single line. Developer B, use this only once. When the new photograph emerged, Holmes held it aloft. It was dim, slightly off-center, but it showed what mattered: the archive room, the chair, the gaslight, and the photograph of Elsie. Within the photograph, framed, immutable. "She's in," Holmes whispered, but not his way. The gaslights in the room dimmed slightly, as if the archive itself was sighing. "What happens now?" I asked. Holmes returned the new image to the wall. He pinned it beside the blurred versions, deliberately setting it apart. "Now the record is complete," he said, "and if he attempts to return to overwrite her, he'll find a layer fixed beyond his reach." I looked once more at the rows of photographs. They were quiet now, still. The shimmer of that strange presence of the observer seemed to have dulled. No new silhouettes moved among the images, no eyes lingered at the edge. Holmes pocketed the viewing lens. "We've reversed the lens," he said. "We have turned the observer into the observed, and once he is seen, once his influence is known, he loses power. But can he return?" Holmes shook his head. "He has nowhere left to hide. The archive exists only because no one looked at it directly. Now we've seen it, we've photographed it, we've exposed it." We turned from the walls, and I noticed it for the first time, the mirror on the far end of the room, flickering faintly. The same mirror we had passed through to enter. It rippled again, now reflecting not the archive room, but the warehouse. "Time to go," Holmes said. We stepped through the mirror and returned to the world we knew. The warehouse behind us now cold, vacant, and silent once more. When we looked back, the mirror showed only our own reflection. The room was gone. And so was he. The aftermath, we returned to Baker Street before dawn. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the glistening cobbles beneath gaslight. Holmes lit a fire, placed the viewing lens in the drawer beneath his desk, and sat down with a calm I had not seen in days. "She's safe now," I said, more to myself than to him. "She's preserved," Holmes corrected. "A witness now, not a victim. One day, someone will stumble upon her image and wonder, perhaps even trace her story. And in doing so, they will join the archive, not as prey, but as curators of memory." I watched as he placed the photograph in his private case of closed cases, the only note affixed. "Miss Elsie Grimwood, not lost, but watching." Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe. "There are few who see the world clearly, Watson. Fewer still who choose to see what lies just beyond the edge of the frame. She was one of them. And now, so are we." I said nothing. Outside, the morning began to stir. Inside, the fire crackled, and somewhere, in some far corner of memory, a photograph remained, unchanging, unforgettable,